The operating room had gone completely silent. Not the usual quiet between incisions, the kind of silence that falls when something happens that nobody has a word for yet. 30 seconds ago, Dr. Garrison Wolfe had been in the middle of telling a nurse to step back, that she was out of her lane, that she needed to remember her place. Now he was staring at that same nurse, hands still bloody, surgical gloves torn at the thumb, while a decorated Army captain stood in the doorway of Trauma Bay 2 with his hand raised in a salute so precise it looked carved from stone. The captain's uniform was still dusty. There was a pressure bandage taped to his left forearm. He hadn't even stopped to have it looked at. He'd walked past 3 attending physicians, 2 residents, and an entire intake desk to get to her. "Sergeant First Class Hayes," his voice cracked slightly on the last syllable. "You're here." Madeline Hayes lowered the suction tube she was holding. She didn't salute back. She just looked at him, this man she hadn't seen in 4 years, and said quietly, "Sit down before you fall down, Captain. You're losing blood." The attending physicians didn't move. The residents didn't move. Dr. Garrison Wolfe, who 40 minutes ago had told her she was replaceable, stood with his mouth open and said absolutely nothing. If this story already has you hooked, follow along, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Kettrick Memorial Hospital sat at the edge of Dunmore, Pennsylvania, in that particular stretch of mid-sized American city where the industrial past was still visible in the skyline and the emergency department never fully slept. It was not a glamorous hospital. It was a working hospital, the kind that absorbed everything the city threw at it and kept moving. Shift workers with crushed fingers, car accidents on Route 11, overdoses, chest pains, the occasional farming injury from the county's outer edges. The staff moved fast and talked faster, and the hierarchy was understood without being written anywhere. Surgeons first, residents second, nurses somewhere further down the chain, and travel nurses lowest of all. Madeline Hayes had arrived 6 weeks ago on a 12-week contract. She was 32 years old, 5'6", and had a way of moving through the ER that some of the nurses described as efficient and others described as unnerving. She didn't rush, exactly. She just never wasted a step. She knew where everything was within her first day. The crash carts, the backup airway kits, the unlabeled drawer where someone had been stashing the good tape for months. She asked few questions and made no complaints, which in a place like Kettrick either meant you were a fast learner or you were hiding something. Most of the staff assumed the former and moved on. Dr. Garrison Wolfe had decided sometime in her second week that it was the latter. He was 47, board certified in trauma surgery, and had the particular confidence of a man who had been the smartest person in most of the rooms he'd ever entered. He wasn't cruel in the obvious way. He didn't shout, didn't throw instruments. He was worse than that. He was precise in his dismissal. He could make a nurse feel invisible with a single redirected sentence. He could undercut a suggestion so smoothly that the person who'd made it would find themselves nodding along to their own erasure. With Madeline, he'd started small. "That's not your call to make. I'll let you know when I need your input. Stick to what's on your assignment sheet, please." She'd taken it without visible reaction, which he seemed to find more irritating than pushback would have been. There was something about her stillness that unsettled him in a way he couldn't name, so instead of examining it, he pushed harder. It was during a chest trauma case in her third week that things first shifted. The patient was a 44-year-old man brought in after a forklift incident at one of the warehouses on the south end of town. Blunt force, possible internal bleeding, BP dropping. Dr. Wolfe was managing the case and moving fast, competently even, but Madeline, checking the portable monitor readout near the foot of the bed, noticed something. "His oxygen saturation's dropping faster than the pressure reading accounts for," she said. Not loudly, just clearly. Could be a tension pneumo developing on the left side. Wolfe didn't look up from the IV line he was placing. "I'm aware of his stats." The trachea looked slightly deviated. I said, "I'm aware." He finally looked at her, and his voice dropped to something flat and administrative. "You're a travel nurse on contract. I'm the attending. Do your job." She stepped back, kept her eyes on the monitor. 40 seconds later, the patient's pressure crashed. The resident on the other side of the bed looked up in alarm. Wolfe was already moving. He'd caught it himself, maybe 30 seconds after she had. And the needle decompression he performed was technically clean. The patient stabilized. Wolf moved to the next case. He never acknowledged what she'd said. Madeline stripped her gloves, dropped them in the biohazard bin, and went to check on the patient in Bay 4. That was the pattern for the next 2 weeks. She saw things early. He dismissed them. Half the time he corrected course anyway, quietly, in a way that made it look like his own observation. The other half he held his ground and occasionally had to manage the fallout. Either way, she got no credit and absorbed whatever friction came her way. The other nurses noticed. Deja Okafor, a staff nurse who'd been at Kettrick for 6 years and had the institutional memory of someone who'd survived 3 chiefs of staff and a merger, started leaving Madeline slightly better supply placements, the kind of small professional kindness that signals alliance without requiring words. He does this with nurses he finds threatening, Deja told her one afternoon in the break room, not looking up from her yogurt. The ones who don't know it should quit. The ones who figure it out usually transfer. Madeline considered this. What are the ones who stay do? Deja finally looked at her. Depends on whether they have a reason to. Madeline didn't answer that. She rinsed her coffee cup, dried it, and went back to the floor. The formal complaint came at the end of week 4. She hadn't expected it to move that fast. In her experience, institutional retaliation had a specific rhythm. The initial friction, then the escalation, then the paperwork. Wolf had compressed the timeline. The complaint, filed through the department's administrative channel and routed to HR and the nursing supervisor, cited 3 incidents of clinical overreach and 1 of insubordination during an active trauma case. The language was careful and professional and designed to be unchallengeable. Madeline read the document in the office of Joyce Partridge, the nursing supervisor, who had the expression of a woman who'd seen this before and was tired of it. You can formally respond, Joyce said, or you can request a transfer. Or, she paused, you can continue working your assignment and let the HR process run its course, which typically takes 3 to 4 weeks. What happens if more complaints come in during that period? Joyce didn't answer immediately. That was itself an answer. Do you want to tell me your side of it? She asked. Madeline set the document down on the desk. She looked out the window at the parking structure across the street and was quiet for a moment, running through what she could say and what she couldn't and what the point of any of it would be. Not right now, she said finally. Joyce watched her. Madeline, if there's something in your background that's relevant here, anything that might help contextualize, I appreciate the concern. She stood up. I'll respond in writing by Friday. She left the office and went back to the floor. And by the time she reached Bay 6, she had already decided not to respond in writing by Friday or any other day. Not because she had nothing to say, because she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had once had to make decisions in approximately 4 seconds that determined whether people lived or died, that this was not the right ground to defend. You don't fight on terrain that's already been shaped against you. You wait. Bad. Word of the complaint moved through the department the way information always moves in hospitals. Officially slowly, practically immediately. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere around Madeline had shifted with that particular institutional cruelty that doesn't require anyone to do anything overt. People just adjusted, slightly fewer handoffs directed to her, slightly more conversations that ended when she entered the room. Dr. Wolf said nothing to her directly, which was more effective than anything he could have said. She worked her shift. She did her job. She did not make it easy for anyone to find fault with her work, because there was none to find, but that was not the point, and everyone involved knew it. On Friday, a resident named Marcus Tillman stopped her in the hallway outside the medication room and said, low enough that only she could hear, "For what it's worth, I saw what happened in Bay 3 with the hemothorax guy. You called it first. Anyone paying attention knew that." Madeline looked at him. He was young, 2nd year, with the slightly overwhelmed energy of someone who was still deciding what kind of doctor he wanted to be. "Thank you," she said. "Is there anything?" "No." She said it without any edge. "But thank you." He nodded and walked away, and she stood for a moment in the hallway and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth. An old habit. Something she'd picked up a long time ago in a place where the air outside smelled like something burning. The call came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. Madeline was 40 minutes into her shift, restocking a supply cart at the end of the hall, when the overhead system activated and the charge nurse's voice came through with that particular controlled urgency that the ER uses when things are about to become unmanageable. Mass casualty incoming. Military transport helicopter went down on Route 9 approximately 11 miles east. Estimated 19 to 24 casualties, multiple critical. All available trauma personnel report to the main bay. We are activating MCI protocol. The cart she'd been restocking sat half-finished. She left it and moved. The ER at Kettrick was not small, but a mass casualty event has a way of shrinking any space immediately. It's not just the physical bodies, it's the noise, the competing urgencies, the way everyone's training collides with the actual weight of what's in front of them. The first wave arrived in 7 minutes. Black Hawk down, 2 crew members, 4 soldiers from the transport detail. A training exercise that had intersected fatally with mechanical failure and a wind shear event over the ridgeline. By the time the second transport arrived, the number had climbed to 11 patients, 6 of them critical. Madeline pulled gloves and moved into the bay. Dr. Wolf was already there, coordinating with 2 other attendings, calling out assignments. He looked up when she entered and said, without hesitation, "Triage support, vitals and documentation. Stay off the primary cases." She didn't argue. She moved to where she'd been directed and started working. What happened in the next 20 minutes was the kind of thing that's difficult to describe accurately afterward, because the people who were there have trouble agreeing on the sequence. What's clear is this: the bay was overwhelmed. 2 of the critical patients were deteriorating faster than the resources available could address. Dr. Wolf was managing a thoracic injury at one end. The second attending, Dr. Priya Nambiar, was dealing with a traumatic hemorrhage that was refusing to cooperate. The third attending had been pulled to a separate case that had arrived simultaneously from an unrelated accident on the interstate. Madeline was documenting vitals on a patient in Bay 7, a soldier, early 20s, shrapnel injuries to the upper left arm and chest, stable but trending wrong, when she heard the alert from across the room. Bay 4. The patient's oxygen saturation had dropped to 81 and was still moving. She looked up. The resident assigned to Bay 4 was standing at the bedside looking at the numbers with the expression of someone who knew something was wrong and did not know what to do next. She was across the room before she made a conscious decision to move. The patient was in his 30s, military, wearing what was left of a flight suit. He was unconscious. His chest wasn't moving right, one side rising, the other not. She put her hand on his neck and felt the trachea, assessed the breath sounds without a stethoscope because there wasn't time, looked at the neck veins, read the pattern of what she was seeing with the part of her that was not trained in nursing but in something older and faster and less forgiving. Tension pneumothorax. "I need a 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular," she said to the resident. He looked at her. "I should get an attending. He's got about 90 seconds. 14-gauge. Now." Something in her voice settled the matter. He turned and grabbed the kit. She decompressed the chest herself, clean and exact, one practiced motion that she had performed in conditions that made this room look like a controlled environment. The rush of air was audible. The patient's color began to shift. The saturation monitor climbed. 81, 84, 88, 92. The resident exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since she arrived. Across the bay, someone had noticed. Then someone else. The work continued. It had to continue. There were still patients in critical condition. But there was a different quality to the attention in the room now, a recalibration happening in real time that no one was quite ready to name yet. Dr. Wolf looked over from his own case. He saw her standing at Bay 4 with the needle kit beside her, and the patient's monitor climbing. His expression shifted through several things quickly before it settled on nothing at all. He looked back at his own patient. She kept working. An hour into the event, when the third transport had arrived and 2 more patients had been stabilized, there was a brief and chaotic reprieve, not a pause in the work, but a shift in its intensity, the way a storm sometimes eases without ending. Madeline was at the supply station pulling fresh materials when she heard boots behind her. She turned. The man standing in the doorway of the trauma bay was wearing a uniform that was dusty at the knees and had a fresh pressure bandage on his left forearm. He was a captain, based on the insignia, broad through the shoulders, mid-30s, with the kind of deliberate stillness that people develop when they've spent time in environments where sudden movement gets people killed. He was scanning the room. Then he found her. The change in his face was immediate and complete. Something moved behind his eyes, recognition, and then something more complicated than relief. He walked toward her, straight through the organized chaos of the bay, past a resident who tried to redirect him, past a nurse who stepped aside without fully understanding why. He stopped 3 feet from her. "Sergeant First Class Hayes." His voice was lower than the room deserved. "You're alive." The room didn't stop, but something in the immediate vicinity of where they were standing went very quiet. Madeline looked at him. Her face didn't show much. "Captain Reeves." He brought his hand up. Not a casual wave, a salute, precise and held. "It's been 4 years," he said. 4 years, 2 months. She said it automatically. She lowered her eyes for just a second, then brought them back up. "You need to let someone look at that arm. It'll keep." "It won't. Sit down." He almost smiled. "Still giving orders." "Someone has to." She moved past him to the supply table and pulled a fresh bandage kit. "Sit. Over there, away from the active cases." He sat. She began to work on his arm, removing the field dressing, assessing the wound. Shrapnel laceration, deep but clean, nothing arterial. Her hands moved with efficiency and no visible emotion, which was its own kind of visible emotion to anyone paying close attention. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Not accusatory, genuinely confused. "I work here. As a nurse, travel contract." He was quiet for a moment while she irrigated the wound. Then, "You know you saved his life. Dominguez, Bay 4. That needle placement, that was yours." "I noticed a tension pneumo. You noticed it before the attending did." "I happened to be closer." Reeves watched her work. "You're not going to just let me say you did something remarkable, are you?" "I'm going to finish your bandage and then go back to work," she said. "That's what's happening right now." He let her finish. She tied the last strip and stepped back, and he stood and looked at her in a way that had weight to it, the weight of shared history and things neither of them had said. "Do the people here know?" he asked. She met his eyes. "No." A beat. "Sergeant," he started. "It's Hayes," she said. "Just Hayes. I'm not—" She paused, and something crossed her face briefly, something tired and complicated. "That was a different place." Reeves nodded slowly. He looked around the room. He looked at Dr. Wolfe, who had turned and was watching this interaction from across the bay with an expression that was working hard to look like nothing. "All right," the captain said, quietly. "For now." That qualifier sat in the air between them. She walked back to her patient. Matt. By early afternoon, the mass casualty event had been managed. Not neatly, nothing like that was ever neat, but contained. 14 of the 19 patients had been stabilized. 2 had been transferred to the surgical ICU. 1 had not made it, which was its own weight that would be carried differently by everyone who'd been in the room. The remaining 2 were in observation. The debrief, when it came, was a compressed version of the real accounting that would happen later. Who did what went right, what went wrong, what needed to change. Dr. Wolfe ran it in the small conference room off the main bay with the 2 other attendings and a cluster of residents and senior nurses. Madeline stood near the back. She watched him reconstruct the morning in his version of it, accurate in its medical specifics, careful in its assignments of credit. The needle decompression in Bay 4 was described as a team response. The specific details of who had performed it were left slightly blurry. She said nothing. But Dr. Nambiar, across the table, looked at her, and Marcus Tillman, sitting 3 seats down, looked at her, and Deja Okafor, standing to her left, looked at her. After the debrief, Wolfe caught her in the hallway. "Good work this morning," he said. It sounded like it had been rehearsed. "Thank you," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something was working in his expression. She could see it clearly, had seen it on other faces in other places, the specific discomfort of a person who has staked their position on a version of someone that is starting to not hold. "The HR process is still active," he said. His voice had dropped slightly. "I want you to know I'm taking that seriously." She looked at him. I know you are. The complaints stand. I understand. He waited, as if he expected something else. She didn't give it to him. All right, he said, and walked away. She watched him go and then turned and walked in the opposite direction, back toward the supply station, and the cart she'd left half-stocked 7 hours ago. And she finished what she'd started because that was the kind of person she was, and always had been, and the weight of the morning. The patience, the captain, the particular look on Wolf's face when she'd walked away from him just now, sat inside her chest in the way things do when you've been carrying them for a long time, and you've gotten very good at making it look like nothing. Captain Reeves had said for now. She thought about that as she counted syringes and logged them in the system and moved on to the next task. For now had a clock on it. She just didn't know how long. Bawasik. At 4:18 that afternoon, she was documenting discharge notes on the last of the observation patients when Deja appeared at her elbow and said, low and fast, "The captain, Reeves. He's been on his phone since noon. One of the transport soldiers told me when they were loading out earlier, she heard him say something about Kettrick. And your name." Madeline kept her eyes on the screen. "How many of the soldiers heard what happened in Bay 4?" she asked. "All of them," Deja said. "Word travels fast in that population." "I know." "Madeline." Deja waited until she turned. "Whatever you're keeping quiet about, whatever that man knew when he looked at you, I'm not asking. But I want you to know that you have at least 4 people in this department who saw what you did today, and we're not going to let it disappear into Wolf's version of events." Madeline looked at her. This woman who'd been at Kettrick 6 years and had the kind of loyalty that wasn't sentimental, just solid, and felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a name for in that moment. "I appreciate that," she said. "That's all I'm saying." Deja turned back to her own workstation. "Carry on." Madeline turned back to her screen, and her phone, sitting silent in her pocket, buzzed once. Unknown number, Pennsylvania area code she didn't recognize. She looked at it for a long moment, then she put it back in her pocket and finished her note and walked to the end of her shift and drove home in the early dark of a Pennsylvania evening and sat at her kitchen table without turning on the lights for a while. In the morning, she would go back. She would do her job. She would navigate whatever Wolf's next move was through the HR process, and she would be careful, and she would keep the cap on everything she was. Or that had been the plan. The phone buzzed again. This time she looked at the message. "Command knows you're here. Someone made contact. I need to know your answer before they do. Call me. Reeves." She set the phone face down on the table. In the dark kitchen of a city that didn't know her name, Madeline Hayes, who had been someone else before she came here, who had done things in places that most of these people couldn't locate on a map, who had been told more than once that what she'd done was extraordinary and had responded each time by packing her things and finding somewhere quieter, sat with the specific weight of a person who is running out of road. She picked the phone back up. She found his number and typed, "Not tonight." She sent it. Then she sat with her hands flat on the table and the dark pressing in around her, and the distinct cold understanding that not tonight was not the same thing as no, and that someone, somewhere, was already making a decision about her life that she had not been asked to be part of. The question was whether she would still be the one holding the door when it opened. She didn't sleep. That wasn't unusual for her. She'd had stretches in her life where sleep was a negotiation rather than a given, something you bargained for in increments and were grateful when you got more than 4 hours. But this was a different kind of wakeful. She lay on top of the covers in her rented apartment 3 blocks from the hospital, staring at the ceiling with the phone on the nightstand, and turned the problem over the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking for the edge that tells you which way it breaks. Command knows you're here. 4 words. She'd known the day would come, had known it in the abstract, the way you know certain things are inevitable without letting yourself look at them directly. She'd been careful. No social media presence under her real name, no professional listings, nothing that connected Madeline Hayes, the travel nurse, to the service record she'd left behind. But careful and invisible were not the same thing, and she'd known that too. Reeves had found her in 6 hours. She got up at 4:30, made coffee she didn't particularly want, and stood at the window watching the parking lot below. A delivery truck idled at the corner. A light was on in the apartment across the street, someone else who couldn't sleep or had to be somewhere early. Ordinary life, moving around her like water around a stone. She had choices. She'd been telling herself that for 4 years. You always have choices. She'd walked away from the service with an honorable discharge and a commendation she'd asked them not to publicize, and she'd picked up a travel nursing contract because it was work she knew how to do, and it kept her moving, which was what she needed, which was what she'd always needed since coming back. The problem with being a person who was good at a particular kind of crisis was that ordinary life kept feeling like it was played in the wrong key. Too slow, too loud in the wrong places, too quiet where the tension should be. She'd been managing. Then Garrison Wolfe had decided she was a problem to be solved, and Captain Reeves had walked through a trauma bay door with dust on his knees, and here she was at 4:30 in the morning calculating exit routes from a life she'd been trying to build. She drank her coffee. She made a second cup. Then she picked up her phone and called Reeves. He answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. Hayes. Tell me what they want, she said. No preamble. 4 years of not speaking to him, and she landed exactly where they'd always operated, which was somewhere past small talk. Colonel Vashti is the one who made contact. You remember her? I remember her. She's running a review of the Kandahar incident. The full review. They've reopened it. Silence. Why now? She asked. Because 3 of the men involved have been identified in connection with a procurement fraud investigation, and someone in JAG decided to pull the thread. Everything connects. He paused. Including your testimony, which you gave and then, in their words, became unavailable. I left the service. You disappeared, Hayes. There's a difference, at least from their perspective. She turned from the window. The coffee had gone cold without her noticing. What does Vashti want? She wants you to come in voluntarily, before they escalate to a formal summons. Another pause. She said, and I'm quoting here, that she's aware you had reasons for what you did, and she wants to hear them from you before this becomes something you don't control. Madeline was quiet for a long moment. That's generous, she said, in a tone that made the word mean something complicated. She's not wrong that the window is short. If this goes to a formal summons, it hits your nursing license. Your employer gets notified. Everything you've built in the last 4 years, I haven't built anything, she said. That's not what I've been doing. He didn't answer that, and his silence was its own form of acknowledgement. How much time? She asked. A week? Maybe 10 days? She looked at the window, at the ordinary parking lot, at the delivery truck that had finally moved on. I'll think about it, she said. I'll think about it, Reeves. That's what I have right now. She ended the call and stood in the kitchen until the light outside started to change. She went in for her shift at 6:45 and worked like nothing had changed, because nothing had yet, and because the alternative was to not work and she wasn't built for that. The ER was post-event quiet, the kind of subdued that settles over a department after something big, everyone moving slightly more carefully, speaking slightly more softly, as if the building itself needed to recover. The soldiers from yesterday's transport had mostly been moved to inpatient rooms or discharged. 2 of the critical cases were in the ICU. The one who hadn't made it was no longer being spoken about in the main bay, which was how hospitals handled the weight of that, not by addressing it, but by creating a quiet space around it, an absence that everyone felt and no one filled. Madeline worked through her morning assignments and kept her head down. She told herself this was strategy, not avoidance, which may or may not have been true. The first indication that something had shifted came at 9:15. She was in Bay 6 with a patient, elderly man, atrial fibrillation, rattled by the experience of his heart doing things it wasn't supposed to, when she became aware of voices in the corridor outside. Not loud, but concentrated. She finished adjusting the patient's telemetry lead, asked him 2 brief questions about his symptoms, and stepped out to find 3 people she hadn't seen before standing near the nurse's station. 2 of them were in civilian clothes. The third was in uniform, not the transport uniform from yesterday. This was something different, the kind of dress uniform that doesn't appear in an ER unless someone has made a deliberate decision to put it there. Deja was behind the station, and she looked at Madeline with an expression that was trying to communicate several things simultaneously. Madeline walked toward them. She kept her pace even. The uniformed officer, a lieutenant colonel, she noted automatically, reading the insignia with the part of her that had never stopped, turned when he heard her approach. He was somewhere in his 50s, compact, with the particular economy of movement that indicated someone who had been doing this a very long time. "Ms. Hayes?" he said. "Yes." "Lieutenant Colonel Arden, Army Medical Command." He extended a hand. His grip was brief and professional. "Do you have a few minutes?" "I'm mid-shift." "I understand. This won't take long." He glanced at the two civilians who had stayed slightly behind him. "We'd prefer somewhere with some privacy, if that's possible." She looked at him for a beat. Then she looked at Deja, who looked back with a carefully neutral expression that was doing a great deal of work. "There's a family consultation room around the corner," Madeline said. "Follow me." The room was small and functional in the way that rooms designed to deliver bad news always are. Soft chairs, a low table, a box of tissues on a side shelf that she'd always found slightly presumptuous. She stood near the window. Arden sat. The two civilians remained standing. "I want to be transparent with you about why we're here," Arden began. "You're aware that Colonel Vashti's office made contact last night?" "Through Captain Reeves, yes." "Good. Then you understand the scope of what's being reviewed." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm here to," he chose his word carefully, "facilitate that process. There are some people who feel strongly that you deserve to know exactly what's happening before any formal action is taken. I appreciate that. There's a complication." She waited. "The hospital," he said. "Specifically, your current situation here. We became aware this morning that there's an active HR process involving your conduct in this department." He looked at her without apology and without judgment. "That's an independent matter. It's not something we have any part in, but it does create a complex picture if things escalate on our end. The optics, I understand optics," she said. "Then you understand that a formal military summons combined with an active HR complaint creates a scenario that's difficult for everyone, including me. Especially you." She looked at him. The two civilians still hadn't spoken, and she'd been trying to determine their function. Legal, she thought, probably JAG adjacent. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "Nothing dramatic. We're asking for a voluntary meeting, off-site, within the week. Review your testimony on the Kandahar matter. Allow the record to be corrected where it needs to be corrected." He paused. "We're aware of what you witnessed. We're aware of why you left. No one here is looking to hold that against you." She almost said something about how comforting she found that, but she caught it. "And the HR situation here?" she asked. He glanced at the civilians briefly. "That's not within our purview." "I understand. I'm asking what happens to it if I cooperate with your process." "Nothing. It remains whatever it is. So I could cooperate fully with you and still lose this job." He didn't answer that, which was the most honest thing he'd done since entering the room. She nodded slowly. "I'll give you an answer by tomorrow morning." He stood. They shook hands. He and the civilians left, and she stayed in the small room for a moment after the door closed, standing by the window with her hands in her pockets and the tissue box sitting on the shelf being silently presumptuous. Then she went back to work. She said nothing to anyone about the meeting for the rest of the day. Deja gave her one long look at the shift change and let it be, which was why Madeline had come to trust her in the particular way you trust people who know when to stay out of your way. The escalation, when it came, arrived from a direction she hadn't been watching. She was 30 minutes from the end of her shift when Joyce Partridge, the nursing supervisor, appeared at the edge of the bay and said, quietly and without preamble, "Garrison filed a second complaint this morning, and he's requested a meeting with the CMO tomorrow at 10. Madeline stopped what she was doing. "On what grounds?" "He's calling it a patient safety issue. He's citing the Bay 4 intervention from yesterday, specifically that you performed a clinical procedure outside your authorized scope." Joyce's voice was flat and careful. "He's framing it as a violation of nursing practice standards." The particular coldness that moved through Madeline in that moment was not panic. She'd learned to distinguish between the two a long time ago. Panic was hot and fast. This was something else, a slow, calculated chill, the recognition that someone had thought this through and chosen the one angle that was hardest to defend from where she was standing. Because he wasn't entirely wrong about the letter of it. A travel nurse performing a needle thoracostomy on an unstable patient without attending authorization was, technically, outside standard nursing scope. The fact that the patient would have been dead in 90 seconds without it was context, not defense, not in a paperwork sense, not in the kind of institutional process that Wolf was clearly intending to weaponize. "Does the CMO know the patient's outcome?" she asked. "Yes." And Dr. Wolf's position is that the outcome is separate from the question of whether the procedure was within your authority to perform. She looked at Joyce. Joyce looked back, and her expression said something that her words hadn't quite reached. "He's not wrong on the technical question," Madeline said. "No," Joyce agreed, "he's not." "So the meeting tomorrow." "The CMO will hear both sides. That's the process." Joyce paused. "I'll be there. I want you to know that." "Thank you. Is there anything at all you want me to know before tomorrow? Anything that might be relevant that you haven't told me?" She thought about Lieutenant Colonel Arden. She thought about Reeves. She thought about the phone message and the word Kandahar and the particular shape of what was closing in from multiple directions at once. "Not yet," she said. Joyce held her gaze for a second longer than she needed to. "All right," she said, and walked away. Madeline finished her shift, changed, and walked out through the ambulance bay entrance because it was shorter, and stopped in the evening air to put on her jacket. Marcus Tillman was there, sitting on a concrete divider, still in his scrubs. He looked like he'd been waiting for her. "I heard about the second complaint," he said. "Word travels fast." "It's a hospital." He stood up. He was doing that thing where someone is working up to something. "I want to go on record. About yesterday." "Marcus, I'm the resident who was in Bay 4. I'm the one who was standing there not knowing what to do." He said it without self-pity, just fact. "You walked in and you knew. You called it, and you did it, and he's alive." His jaw was tight. "I'll say that to the CMO, to the board, to whoever needs to hear it. I don't care what it costs me." She looked at him in the evening light. He was young and angry in the clean, uncomplicated way that people are when they haven't yet learned that institutional anger almost never lands where you aim it. She appreciated it anyway. "Don't say it like that," she told him. "Don't frame it as defiance. Frame it as clinical observation, what you saw, what you assessed, what the outcome was. No editorializing." He blinked. Yeah. Okay, yeah. "And write it down tonight. Everything you can remember in order. Don't send it to anyone. Just have it." He nodded. She walked past him toward the parking structure, then stopped and turned back. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." He nodded again, and she turned away before she had to watch him be earnest about it, which was not something she had the capacity for right now. She called Reeves from the car. "I'll meet with Vashti," she said. "Friday. I'll come to you. I'll set it up." He was quiet for a moment. "What changed?" "Things moved faster than I expected." "The hospital situation?" "Among other things." She pulled out of the parking structure and onto the street. The evening was cold and clear. "Reeves, when Vashti reviews the Kandahar testimony, what's the most likely outcome?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. He'd never been the kind of person who answered questions like that too quickly. "If you're honest about what you saw and what you reported and why the original testimony was incomplete," he said finally, "I think Vashti clears you. I think she always intended to. The people she's actually investigating are the ones who buried the original report. And if the hospital process accelerates before Friday, then it gets complicated. Define complicated. Suspension of your contract triggers a licensing review. Licensing review creates a record that intersects with the military process in ways that get messy for everyone." He paused again. "You need to make sure you're still employed on Friday, Hayes." "I'm aware," she said. "Thank you for the specificity." She ended the call. She drove the 3 blocks home and parked and sat in the dark car for a moment, thinking about Garrison Wolfe and the meeting he'd scheduled with the CMO for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and about Marcus Tillman writing his statement in his apartment somewhere in this city, and about the woman she'd been in a different place in a different life, who had made decisions under conditions that all of this, did not come close to matching. She went inside. She made dinner she didn't particularly want, ate half of it, and opened her laptop. She spent 40 minutes writing something she hadn't written in 4 years, a personal statement, careful and precise and complete, covering what she had done in Bay 4 and why, what her training and experience were, and what she had chosen not to disclose when she took the contract at Kettrick. She wrote it plainly. She did not ask for sympathy or frame herself as a victim of anything. She stated facts and owned her choices and let the document be what it was. She read it back once. Then she saved it, closed the laptop, and went to bed. She was still awake at midnight when her phone lit up. The number was Joyce Partridge's. At midnight. She answered immediately. "Joyce, I'm sorry to call this late." Joyce's voice was tight in a way Madeline had never heard from her before. "The CMO meeting tomorrow. It's been moved up." "Moved up when?" 8 o'clock and... A pause. "They've added someone. Garrison called the COO this evening. Patricia Holt is joining the meeting." Boo, Madeline was quiet. Patricia Holt was the Chief Operations Officer of Kettrick Memorial. She was not a physician. She was not someone who typically involved herself in nursing conduct reviews. She was someone who got involved when an institution had decided it needed to manage a situation rather than investigate it. Her presence at an 8 a.m. meeting meant someone had already made a decision, and the meeting was the announcement, not the process. "Madeline," Joyce said, "I think you should prepare for the possibility that tomorrow's meeting ends with your contract being terminated." The word terminated sat in the air between them. "I know," Madeline said. "Thank you for telling me." "Is there anything?" "There's one thing." She sat up in the dark. "Can you get me into the building before 7:30, before anyone else is in administrative?" Joyce was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "I need to print something." Another silence. "I'll meet you at the side entrance at 7:15, Joyce said. "Don't be late." She ended the call, and Madeline set the phone down and sat in the dark with her hands in her lap. Somewhere across the city, in whatever hotel a lieutenant colonel from Army Medical Command stayed at when he was in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, Arden was probably sleeping. Reeves was probably not. And Garrison Wolfe was almost certainly lying in whatever comfort his life afforded him, already writing the version of tomorrow in his head where this resolved itself the way he'd designed it to. She thought about the patient in Bay 4. She thought about the way the saturation monitor had climbed, 81, 84, 88, 92. The numbers moving with that particular slow determination that meant someone's body was pulling itself back from the edge. She thought about what she'd written tonight and what it would mean to walk into that room tomorrow and put it on the table. She thought about Reeves saying, "You need to still be employed on Friday." She turned the problem over, looked for the edge that told her which way it broke. At 1:15 in the morning, she got up, opened her laptop, and wrote one more document. This one was shorter, addressed to Lieutenant Colonel Arden. It asked for one specific thing, not an extension of time, not a modification of the process. A single piece of information that she believed they had and that she needed before 8 a.m. She sent it and closed the laptop. She lay back down. And this time, somewhere around 2 in the morning, she actually slept. Not well, not long, but enough to reach the bottom of the night and come back up, which was sometimes all you could ask of it. At 6:47, her phone lit up again. It was an email from an address she didn't recognize with a military domain sent at 6:43 a.m. She opened it. It was 2 sentences and an attached document. "We anticipated this might be necessary. Attachment is authorized for your use." She opened the attachment. She read it once. Then she got dressed. The side entrance of Kettrick Memorial at 7:15 in the morning had the particular emptiness of institutional spaces before the day decides what it's going to be. Joyce was already there when Madeline arrived, holding a key card and wearing the expression of someone who is committed to a position without being entirely sure of the ground beneath it. She didn't ask about the email. She scanned the door open and walked Madeline through the back corridor to the administrative suite without speaking, which was the right call. The printer in the nursing supervisor's office was slow and slightly off on its alignment, the kind of minor mechanical failure that nobody ever quite got around to fixing. Madeline stood over it while it worked and read the attachment one more time on her phone. She'd read it 3 times already. She was looking for the thing she might have missed, the clause or the qualifier that changed what she thought it meant. It wasn't there. The document was a letter on Department of Army letterhead, signed by Colonel Nadia Vashti, Legal Review Division, dated 2 days ago. It was addressed to Kettrick Memorial Hospital's administrative leadership, though clearly it had not been sent yet. That part was contingent, dependent on whether she gave them the signal. The letter stated, in the careful and precise language of military legal correspondence, that Madeline Hayes was a material witness in an active investigation, that her professional standing and licensure were matters of direct interest to Army Medical Command, and that any adverse employment action taken against her during the period of that investigation would be subject to formal review for potential interference. It was not a guarantee. It was not a shield. It was a fact placed on a table at a specific moment. The printer finished. She folded the pages once and put them in her jacket pocket. "Thank you," she said to Joyce. Joyce looked at her, really looked, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in the past 6 weeks. "Who are you?" she asked. Not accusatory, just tired of not knowing. "Someone who did a job a long time ago," Madeline said, "and kept doing it." She walked out toward the administrative conference room and didn't look back. They were already seated when she arrived at 7:58. Garrison Wolfe on one side of the table, posture arranged in the careful neutrality of someone who has rehearsed. Next to him, a woman she recognized from photographs in the hospital directory, Patricia Holt, the COO, 50-something, with the polished efficiency of someone accustomed to ending problems cleanly. The CMO, Dr. Raymond Osei, sat at the head of the table. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s who had the reputation of being fair and the reality of being careful, which were not always the same thing. A hospital attorney sat to the side, yellow legal pad already open. Joyce Partridge was in the corner, not at the table. Observer status. She'd been allowed in but not invited to the table, which said everything about how this was structured. Madeline sat down across from Wolfe and set nothing on the table yet. "Ms. Hayes," Dr. Osei began, "thank you for coming in early. I want to be direct with you about why we've convened." He had a formal, almost courtly manner that she thought was probably genuine and not entirely useful in rooms like this. "Dr. Wolfe has raised a concern, and Ms. Holt and I felt it warranted immediate attention given the events of the past 2 days." "I understand," Madeline said. "The concern is specific. On Tuesday morning, during the mass casualty response, you performed a needle thoracostomy on a patient in Bay 4 without attending authorization. That procedure is outside the defined scope of practice for a registered nurse under Pennsylvania nursing standards." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite an apology. "Is that characterization accurate?" "It's accurate as far as it goes," she said. Wolfe shifted slightly. He'd expected a denial. "I performed the decompression," she continued. "The resident present can confirm the clinical picture: tension pneumothorax, deteriorating saturation, estimated 90 seconds or less to arrest. There was no attending available to authorize within that window." "That determination," Wolfe began. Osei raised a hand slightly, and Wolfe stopped. "The determination of time frame," Osei said carefully, "would be contested in a licensing review. The position of this meeting, as I understand it, is that the procedure was outside your authority, regardless of the clinical reasoning." "That's our position," Holt said. It was the first thing she'd said, and she said it with the flat certainty of someone who deals in policies, not patients. Madeline looked at her. Then she reached into her jacket pocket. She placed the letter on the table and slid it to the center. Nobody moved for a moment. "What is this?" Osei asked. "A letter from Army Medical Command. Lieutenant Colonel Arden can confirm its authenticity. He's currently in Dunmore and reachable at the number on the letterhead." She kept her voice level. "I'm a material witness in an active military investigation. That status has implications for any adverse employment action taken against me during the investigation period." Holt picked up the letter. She read it. Her expression did not change in any obvious way, but something behind it did. Wolfe read it next. The slight flush at his collar was the only indication of what was happening in his chest. "This doesn't change the scope of practice question," the attorney said from the side of the table. He was trying to sound confident about it. "No," Madeline agreed. "It changes the institutional exposure associated with how you resolve it." She looked at Osei. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the process to run correctly. That's all." The room was quiet for a long moment. Osei picked up the letter himself. "Read it slowly." "I want to recess this meeting," he said finally. 20 minutes. I need to make a call." She waited in the hallway with Joyce, who stood beside her and said nothing, which was the right call again. At the 17-minute mark, Holt came out of the conference room and walked toward them with the specific directional energy of someone who has made a decision they're not happy about. "Dr. Osei is going to recommend suspending the HR process pending further review," she said. She was looking at Madeline with an expression that contained several things, none of them warm. "That is not an admission that Dr. Wolf's concerns are unfounded." "I understand," Madeline said. "Your contract will remain active while the review period continues." She paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "You're telling me I still have a job." Holt looked at her for 1 second longer than necessary. Then she turned and walked back into the conference room. Joyce exhaled slowly. "You knew," she said. "You came in here knowing." "I came in here with information," Madeline said. "That's different." "Is it?" She didn't answer that because the honest answer was complicated, and the hallway wasn't the place for it. Inside the conference room, Wolf's voice rose briefly, then was cut off. Then nothing. The rest of the morning moved with that particular quality that follows institutional standoffs. The surface returned to normal, while underneath, things kept shifting. She went back to the floor. She did her job. The nurses who'd heard rumors processed those rumors in glances and half-conversations she wasn't part of, and she let that happen because it was going to happen regardless. Wolf appeared in the bay at 11:30. He walked past her twice without speaking. On the third pass, he stopped at the medication station 6 feet from where she was charting. "You should know," he said, low and controlled, "that this isn't over." She looked up. "I know. That letter buys you time. It doesn't buy you anything else." "I'm aware." He held her gaze. There was something in his face that wasn't quite what she'd expected. Not just the institutional cold of someone managing a situation, but something raw underneath it. She recognized it eventually as the specific discomfort of a man who has built his professional identity on being the most capable person in his vicinity and has encountered, twice now, evidence that the category is more complicated than he'd arranged. "Why are you still here?" he asked. The question landed differently than the ones before it, less controlled, more genuine. She considered him. "Same reason as you," she said. "The work." He looked at her for another beat, then walked away, and she watched him go and turn back to her screen. She charted 2 notes, requested a lab follow-up, and then sat for a moment with her hands on the keyboard and her eyes not quite focused on anything. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Reeves. She stepped away from the station and answered. "Friday's confirmed," he said. "Vashtai's office, 10 a.m. I'll be there." "Did it work this morning?" "Process is suspended." A short pause. "Good." Then, "Hayes, there's something you need to know before Friday." The flatness in his voice was new. Not the operational calm she knew from him, but something more deliberate. "Tell me," she said. "The Kandahar review. It's broader than what Vashti told me initially. They've been building it for 8 months. 3 officers named in the fraud investigation have been formally charged. 2 of them are using their defense strategy to reframe what happened, specifically to suggest that the original incident report was manipulated by someone lower in the chain in order to redirect blame." He stopped. "They're naming you, Hayes, in the defense filings." The hallway she was standing in was suddenly very specific in its details. The scuff on the baseboard paint, the flicker of the second fluorescent light from the end, the distant sound of a monitor alarming somewhere in the bay and then going quiet. "They're claiming I falsified the initial report," she said. Not a question. "They're claiming you had a personal motivation to misrepresent the events, and that the commendation you received was contingent on that misrepresentation." His voice had gone very careful. It's built on nothing, but it's in official filings, which means it's real in the way that things become real when they're written down. She walked to the window at the end of the hall and stood looking at the parking structure. Does Vashti believe it? No. Her office is pursuing it as a deflection tactic, which is what it is. But the hearing... Another pause. It's not going to be comfortable. I've been in uncomfortable hearings. Not with your nursing license in the adjacent room. She was quiet for a moment. Who else knows about the defense filing? She asked. In this building? Nobody, as far as I can tell. He hesitated. But these things don't stay contained. If someone in Wolf's camp is paying attention to public military records, they would need to know where to look. People find what they're motivated to find. She closed her eyes for a second, opened them. The parking structure was still there, gray and ordinary and utterly indifferent. Is there anything in the filing that has any connection to what happened in this ER? She asked. Anything that could be used to build a picture? Not yet, Reeves said. But if the HR situation here becomes public record, and the defense team or their investigators connect your name to a conduct complaint, it becomes circumstantial support for a narrative about a pattern. Yes? She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth. All right, she said. All right isn't really adequate here. I know that, but it's what I have. She shifted the phone. I'll be at Vashti's office Friday at 10. I'll need everything you can get me on what's in those filings before I walk in. I can do that. And Reeves. She turned from the window. Thank you for the letter this morning. I know that came from you. He was quiet for a second. Vashti made the call. But you asked her to. Another pause. Get through Friday, he said, and ended the call. She was back at the nurses' station at 12:40 when the call came from the ICU. One of the soldiers from Tuesday's mass casualty, the one she'd stabilized in Bay 4, the tension pneumo, had been moved from critical to stable that morning and was now asking, apparently with some insistence, to speak with the nurse who'd treated him. The ICU charge nurse relayed this with the slightly bemused tone of someone conveying information they didn't entirely understand the significance of. Madeline said she'd go up on her break. She found him in a bed by the window. His name was Specialist Daniel Orvez, 24 years old, with a shaved head, and the particular stillness of someone whose body has recently been through something and is still accounting for it. He had a chest tube drainage system on his right side and an IV in his left arm, and was sitting up at about a 30-degree angle, which was about as far as the drainage assembly allowed. She pulled a chair to the bedside. You wanted to talk to me, she said. He looked at her steadily. You're the one who did the needle thing. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I was conscious for part of it. I don't know if you knew that. She hadn't. I didn't. I couldn't. Nothing was working right. Couldn't get air. And then you were there and you just... He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly. You knew what to do. I knew what was wrong, she said. That's different. He shook his head slightly, the slow way people do when they're rejecting a distinction that feels important to them. My buddy Reyes, he was in the same transport. He's in the room down the hall. He told me what Reeves said about you. He looked at her carefully. About what you used to do. She kept her face still. I'm not going to ask, he said. I just wanted to say, I know what it looks like when someone's done time in a bad place. The way you moved in that bay. The way you talked to the resident. He paused. You didn't hesitate. Hesitating wouldn't have helped you. No. He looked out the window for a moment, then back. Are you in trouble because of what you did? She considered whether to answer. There's a process, she said. Because of me. Because of a lot of things. She stood up. You should rest. The chest tube comes out in 48 to 72 hours if the lung stays expanded. Will you be here? I'm on contract through next month. He nodded slowly. Reeves is coming back Thursday. He said he had some things to settle before the weekend. She absorbed that without reacting. Rest, she said. Drink the fluids they give you even when you don't feel like it. She walked out of the ICU and down the stairwell and stood for a moment on the landing between the third and second floors with her back against the concrete wall. Reeves was coming back Thursday. The hearing was Friday. And somewhere in a legal defense filing she hadn't seen yet, her name was attached to a version of events that someone had constructed specifically to undo the things she had been and done and would spend the rest of her life either living with or running from. She pushed off the wall and went back to the floor. She was halfway through the afternoon when the overhead PA activated, not an emergency tone, just the general page system, and the voice that came through was one she didn't recognize. This is an announcement for all Kettrick Memorial staff. The Department of the Army has requested that the following individuals report to the main conference room on the administrative level at 4:30 today. She stopped moving. 3 names followed. Hers was not one of them. Garrison Wolfe's was. The announcement finished and the PA clicked off, and the bay returned to its ordinary sounds. Monitors, wheels on linoleum, a phone ringing at the station, as if nothing had happened. Madeline stood where she was for 3 more seconds. Then she went back to her patient in Bay 9, a 41-year-old woman with a laceration on her forearm from a kitchen accident who had been waiting patiently and deserved to stop waiting. She cleaned the wound, placed 4 sutures with the kind of steady hands that don't ask permission from the rest of what's happening in your body, covered it, and explained wound care instructions in a voice that gave no indication that she'd just heard Garrison Wolfe's name announced over the hospital PA in connection with a Department of Army summons. She walked the patient to discharge. She returned the suture kit to its proper location. She charted the visit. Then she went to find Deja. She found her in the supply room, which had become their unofficial location for conversations that required walls. Deja was counting IV bags with the focused expression of someone who counts things when they need to think, which Madeline had noticed before. "You heard it," Deja said without turning around. "I heard it." Wolf's been in his office since it came over, door closed. She set down a bag and turned. Priya Nambiar walked past and said he looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under him. Madeline didn't say anything to that. "What did they call him in for?" Deja asked. "I don't know exactly." Which was mostly true. She knew the architecture of it, the investigation, the defense filings, the military's interest in establishing a clear record, but she didn't know what specifically Arden's office had decided to present to Wolfe and the other 2 people named in the announcement, and she wasn't going to speculate out loud about it. "The other 2 names," Deja said. "One of them was Holloway." Madeline stilled. "Sandra Holloway? Risk management?" "She's been in HR since March. She's the one who processed both of Wolfe's complaints against you." Deja looked at her steadily. "The third name was someone from the legal office. I didn't catch it." Madeline thought about the letter Arden had sent. She thought about interference with a material witness and what that phrase meant in the context of 2 HR complaints filed against her in the middle of an active military investigation. She thought about the fact that Arden had anticipated she might need the letter before the meeting that morning, which meant he'd known about the complaints, which meant someone had been looking at Kettrick's internal records before they put that letter together. "They've been watching the HR situation," she said, mostly to herself. "What?" "Nothing." She refocused. "When's the conference room meeting?" 4:30. It was 2:17. "All right," she said. Deja crossed her arms. "Are you going to tell me what's actually happening, or are we doing another round of, 'I appreciate the concern,' and then you go be cryptic somewhere else?" The question landed with enough directness that Madeline almost smiled. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know if you're okay." The simplicity of it caught her off guard in a way the tactical questions hadn't. She held it for a moment before answering. "I'm functional," she said. "That's not the same thing." "I know." She looked at the IV bags lined up on the shelf, the alphabetized labels, the small institutional orderliness of it. "There's a military investigation into something that happened before I came here. I was involved. I reported something I saw, and then I left the service and the people I reported decided to make the report go away. Now they're under formal review and they're trying to take me down with them. She kept her voice flat and even. "Wolfe's complaints, the HR process. Someone may have decided it was useful to have a professional conduct flag on my record right now. It makes the story they're telling about me easier to sell. Deja was very still. Someone coordinated it, she said. I don't know that. A pause. But it's possible. The supply room was quiet for a moment. The meeting this morning, Deja said slowly, you walked in with that letter. Yes. You already knew they might try to terminate you. I thought it was possible. Deja looked at her with the particular expression of someone revising an assessment they'd thought was already complete. How long have you been running this in parallel? The hospital situation and the military situation? Since Tuesday morning, she paused, when Reeves walked through the bay door. 3 days. 2.5. Deja was quiet again. Then she uncrossed her arms and turned back to her IV bags. You should eat something before 4:30, she said. You look like you've had coffee and nothing else since 6. It was not wrong. At 4:22, she was at the nurse's station charting when she saw Wolf walk past the bay entrance toward the elevator. He was in his white coat, which he'd kept on, which seemed like a choice. The coat is credential. The coat is insistence on what he was in a building that was temporarily questioning it. His face was controlled. He didn't look at the bay. She watched him pass and then looked back at her screen. Marcus Tillman appeared beside her 17 minutes later, slightly breathless, with the energy of someone who has information and has been physically moving to deliver it. The meeting, he said, low. It ran long. They're still in there. How do you know? Osei's assistant came down to reschedule his 5 o'clock, said the conference room was occupied with a sensitive matter. He paused. And Holloway's assistant is at her desk looking like she's been told to stay available. Madeline looked at him. How long have you been tracking this? Since the PA announcement. He didn't look remotely apologetic about it. I wrote the statement. The clinical one, like you said. I sent a copy to Osei's office. She hadn't told him to do that. She looked at him for a moment. Did you run that past anyone? She asked. No. He held her gaze. Should I have? She thought about it. A resident's unsolicited clinical statement to the CMO's office was either very helpful or very complicated, depending on how the next 12 hours moved. She couldn't control it either way. Keep your head down tonight, she said. Whatever comes out of that meeting, let it come out. Don't add to it. He nodded. Then, what's going to come out of it? I don't know yet. Which was true, and also not completely true, and he seemed to understand that there was a distinction there he wasn't going to get more than that. He walked away. She finished her chart, clocked out at 6, and drove home knowing she wasn't going to hear anything official until the morning, and that there was nothing she could do to accelerate the machinery that was now moving. She ate something. She read the defense filing documents that Reeves had sent through in an encrypted folder. 63 pages of careful legal fabrication built around true facts arranged in a false order, which was the most effective kind of lie because it was the hardest kind to disprove quickly. Her name appeared 11 times. The incident they described, a forward operating base, a command decision that went wrong, a report filed afterward, was recognizable to her the way a photograph taken from an unexpected angle is recognizable. The same shapes, wrong light. She read all 63 pages. Then she wrote 4 pages of her own in response, handwritten, specific, with dates and details, and the names of people who had been present who were not the people named in the defense filing. She wrote it the way she'd been trained to write incident reports, not persuasively, just accurately, in the order things happened. She sealed it in an envelope. She'd bring it to Vashti tomorrow. She went to sleep at 10:30 and woke at 3 from a dream she couldn't locate on waking, just the residue of it, a feeling of being in a space that was too small and not being able to move the walls. She got up, drank water, went back to bed. The call came at 7:48, not Reeves, not Arden, Joyce Partridge, which was its own information. You need to come in, Joyce said. I'm off today. I know, Osei is asking for you specifically. 8:30. She looked at the ceiling of her bedroom. What happened in the meeting yesterday? Joyce paused, and in that pause was the weight of something significant being carefully chosen. Wolf submitted his resignation last night, she said. Effective immediately. Madeline sat up. Holloway has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, Joyce continued. The specifics of why are above my access level, but the language being used in the formal notice is potential conflict of interest in the processing of staff conduct complaints. A breath. And Osei wants to talk to you this morning. She was quiet for a moment. I'll be there at 8:30, she said. She showered, dressed, drove. The morning was gray and damp. The kind of Pennsylvania autumn morning that feels like it's deciding whether to commit to the season. She found herself noting the details of the drive with the particular focus that comes when something is ending or changing and you're not yet sure which. Osei's office was on the 4th floor, a corner room with windows that looked out over the hospital's back campus. He was behind his desk when she arrived, and he stood when she came in, which was not what she'd expected. Ms. Hayes, sit down, please. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, which she thought was not deliberate, just the restlessness of someone navigating something they hadn't fully mapped yet. I'll be direct, he said, settling into his chair. Yesterday's meeting involved Lieutenant Colonel Arden and 2 members of his legal team, as well as Dr. Wolfe, Ms. Holloway, and our hospital attorney. He folded his hands on the desk. Arden presented documentation. I'm not at liberty to share the full contents, but I can tell you that what was presented raised significant concerns about the processing of the HR complaints filed against you. She waited. Specifically, he continued, there is evidence suggesting that the second complaint, the one citing the Bay 4 intervention as a scope of practice violation, was filed with knowledge of your status as a military witness, and that the framing of the complaint was shaped, at least in part, by communication between Dr. Wolfe and a party external to this institution. She kept her face still. An external party, she said. I can't be more specific than that. His eyes were careful. What I can tell you is that this institution takes that kind of interference very seriously. We have never been, willing to have our HR processes used as instruments for external agendas. She nodded slowly. Dr. Wolfe's resignation was his own decision, Osei said. We did not ask for it, but we accepted it. Ms. Holloway's situation is being reviewed by our legal team. He paused. The HR file against you is being closed. Both complaints are being withdrawn from the record. The room was quiet. She became aware of the small sounds of it. The ventilation system, a phone somewhere down the hall, the rain starting against the window. Withdrawn entirely? She asked. Entirely. She sat with that for a moment. Not relief exactly. Relief was too simple a word for something that had taken this long to arrive at. More like a pressure that had been present for so long it had stopped being identifiable as pressure, now becoming identifiable by its absence. I want to be transparent with you about something, she said. Osei waited. The military investigation, the one I'm a witness in, involves events from 4 years ago. My testimony was incomplete at the time because I was under significant pressure to keep it that way. I'm going to Vashti's office tomorrow to correct that record. She held his gaze. Whatever comes out of that hearing could become public. It may create additional attention around my time here. I thought you should know that before it happens rather than after. He studied her. Is there anything in that hearing that creates liability for this institution? No, my conduct here has been entirely separate. And the Bay 4 intervention stands on its own clinical and ethical grounds. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, when you walked into the meeting yesterday morning with that letter, you'd known since 6:47 a.m. that the military was moving. Yes. And you came in anyway. I needed to see what Wolfe was going to do when the ground shifted. Something crossed his face. Not quite admiration, more the complicated expression of someone encountering a level of strategic thinking they hadn't anticipated from the direction it came from. Ms. Hayes, he said slowly, I owe you an apology. This institution processed 2 complaints against you without adequate scrutiny of their origins, and that failure put you in an untenable position. She looked at him. The apology was genuine, which made it harder to receive cleanly than the clinical acknowledgement of wrongdoing would have been. Thank you, she said. Is there anything you need from us, in terms of support going into tomorrow? No. She paused. Actually, one thing. If Arden's office contacts you again, I'd appreciate knowing directly. Of course. He stood, signaling the meeting's end. They shook hands. His grip was solid and direct. For what it's worth, he said, what you did in that bay, the full scope of your clinical instinct in a crisis. I've reviewed the documentation. The outcome speaks clearly. She nodded once and left. She was in the parking lot, sitting in her car without having started it yet, when Reeves called. Wolf resigned, she said when she picked up. I know. Arden called me this morning. A pause. How are you doing? Still calculating. That's very you. She could hear him moving. Footsteps. A door. I'm at the hospital. I told you I was coming Thursday. Can you meet me somewhere that isn't a trauma bay? There's a coffee place on Miller Street, 3 blocks east. 20 minutes. She drove there and ordered something she didn't particularly want and found a table near the window, which had become a habit. The window, the sight line, the awareness of what was outside. Old habits that didn't expire. Reeves arrived in civilian clothes, which was its own small surprise. He looked different without the uniform. Not smaller, but more like a person and less like a function. He ordered at the counter and brought his coffee to the table and sat across from her and looked at her the way he used to in the debrief room after difficult operations. Directly, without the social filler that most people use to manage the discomfort of serious situations. Arden told me what was in Wolf's external communications, he said. She waited. The contact wasn't random. There's a civilian consultant named Ferris who's worked adjacent to the defense team in the Kandahar case. He had access to the witness list, and he had Wolf's contact information because they apparently share a professional network, medical conference circuit, some board membership overlap. He paused. It looks like Ferris fed Wolf the framing for the second complaint. Not the first. That was Wolf's own operation. But the scope of practice angle, the timing, the specific language that came from outside. She absorbed this. So Wolf didn't know he was being used, she said. He knew enough to be useful, Reeves said. Whether he understood the full shape of it, he shrugged. Probably not. He had his own reasons to want you neutralized. Ferris just gave him a sharper tool. She looked out the window at Miller Street, at the rain moving through the light. The defense team was monitoring my situation here, she said. They knew I was on a travel contract. They knew about the friction with Wolf. They waited until the mass casualty event created a technical scope of practice issue, and then they moved. That's the working theory. And Arden can prove the Ferris connection? Enough to put it in front of Vashti. He sipped his coffee. The defense strategy just got significantly more complicated. Their star move was creating a parallel narrative where you're professionally compromised before you testify. That move is now on the record as coordination. She sat with that for a long moment. The coffee shop around them had the comfortable noise of a mid-morning Thursday. A barista calling names, a couple talking quietly near the wall, someone's laptop playing low music. Ordinary life, doing what it does. Reeves, she said, the original incident, Kandahar. She looked at him. How much of what I reported, what I was pressured to walk back, has Vashti already reconstructed from other sources? He set his cup down. Most of it. There are 3 other witnesses who've come forward in the past 8 months. People who were there and who've been waiting, same as you, for someone with enough authority to actually pursue it. His voice was careful. You're not walking in there tomorrow to carry this alone. You're walking in to confirm what the record is already starting to show. Something shifted in her chest. Not dramatically, nothing dramatic, just a slow release of a particular tension she'd been holding for 4 years, like a static charge looking for somewhere to go. Why didn't you tell me that before? She asked. Because you needed to decide to come in on your own terms. Not because you thought it would be easier than you feared. She looked at him. That's manipulative, she said. Yes, he agreed without apology. It's also how I knew your answer would hold when you got there. She couldn't entirely argue with that, which was its own irritation. They sat with their coffee and the window and the rain, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke, which was one of the things she'd always valued about working with him, the ability to be in a silence that wasn't asking for anything. After tomorrow, she said eventually. What happens to the contract here? That's your call entirely. But what's your read? He considered. I think OC would extend it. I think the department would be different to work in, with Wolf gone. He looked at her. I think you've been moving for 4 years because it was easier than standing still and letting the thing catch up to you. And I think the thing is almost caught up, regardless. She didn't answer that. There's also the question, he said carefully, of whether you want to come back. Come back where? Medical Command has a civilian advisory track. Experienced practitioners who consult on battlefield medicine protocols, training, equipment decisions. Vashti mentioned it to me. Unofficially. He held up a hand before she could respond. I'm not the messenger for that. I'm telling you it exists and that you'd be a name that came up naturally for it. She looked out the window for a long moment. I'm a travel nurse on a 12-week contract in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, she said. That's where you are. Not necessarily what you are. She let that sit. Tomorrow, she said. Let me get through tomorrow. He nodded. They finished their coffee. He walked her to her car and stood in the rain for a moment without moving to leave, and she recognized the expression on his face, the one he used when there was something else, and he was deciding whether it was his to say. What? She asked. Dominguez, he said. The soldier from Bay 4. He asked me to tell you something when I saw you. She waited. He said, and this is a quote, so forgive the grammar, tell her she's the reason I'm going to be at my daughter's birthday next month. I want her to know that. She stood in the wet parking lot and felt something arrive in her that she didn't have a name for, that was also somehow not nameless at all. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed and walked away. Bosham. The hearing was at 10 Friday morning in an office building 12 miles from Dunmore, in a suite of rooms that looked like every government facility she'd ever been in, functional, slightly underfunded, committed to being unremarkable. Colonel Vashti was a woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the patient, exacting manner of someone who had spent a career in spaces where precision was the only thing that kept the facts from becoming someone's fiction. Madeline sat across the table from her and 2 attorneys from JAG and gave her account of the incident in Kandahar, all of it, in order, with dates and names and specific details that she had maintained in her memory for 4 years with the same discipline she applied to everything else she'd been trained to hold on to. She spoke for 2 hours. Vashti asked questions, precise, specific, none of them designed to trap her, all of them designed to locate exact points in the record that needed anchor. The JAG attorneys took notes without speaking. Madeline answered everything directly, corrected 2 of her own statements when she caught a detail she'd misplaced chronologically, and did not minimize or expand anything beyond what she actually knew. When it was done, Vashti sat back in her chair. Ms. Hayes, she said, the record you've provided today, including the discrepancy between your original testimony and what you've given us here, do you want to speak to why the original statement was incomplete? I was told, Madeline said, by a superior officer I trusted at that time, that full disclosure would jeopardize an active operation and expose personnel who hadn't consented to that exposure. I understood that to be a genuine command concern. She paused. I later came to understand it as a containment strategy for people who needed the incident not to have happened the way it happened. And at the time you weren't certain which it was. No, I gave the benefit of the doubt I shouldn't have given. Vashti was quiet for a moment. That's an honest accounting. It's an accurate one. Whether it was honest in the moment is a different question. The colonel looked at her with something that was not quite approval but occupied the adjacent space. We'll have additional questions as the formal review proceeds. You'll be notified through official channels. She closed the folder in front of her. Off the record, and I mean that specifically, the pattern of what you experienced here, the use of external contacts to create professional pressure on a witness, is something we are pursuing vigorously. The people responsible for that are already significantly worse off than they were 10 days ago. Madeline nodded. One more thing, Vashti said. The commendation in your service record, the one the defense filing attempted to reframe as contingent on your misrepresentation. She met Madeline's eyes. It was reviewed by 3 independent evaluators as part of our preparation for this hearing. Their assessment was unanimous. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Madeline drove back to Dunmore in the early afternoon in light rain that was thinning out as she moved west. She kept both hands on the wheel and the radio off and let the drive be what it was. A passage from one thing to something she hadn't fully mapped yet. She pulled into the parking lot of her apartment building and sat for a moment before going in. Her phone showed 3 texts from Deja, checking in the way Deja checked in, which was practically and without drama. One from Marcus Tillman, which just said, well, and which she would answer when she had something to say. One from an unknown number that turned out, when she opened it, to be from Specialist Dominguez, which she hadn't expected and which said simply, Reeves gave me your number. Hope that's okay. I heard today went well. She sat with that for a moment. Then she got out of the car and went inside, and she was standing in her kitchen making coffee when her phone rang, a number she recognized now as Ose's direct line. She answered. Ms. Hayes? His voice was different than it had been in his office, less administrative, more direct. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. It's fine. I'll be brief. The hospital board met this afternoon. An emergency session. The situation warranted it. A pause. There are going to be changes here, significant ones. We're restructuring how complaints are processed, how HR interfaces with outside parties, how the department handles witness to clinical decision-making discrepancies. He stopped. We'd like you to be part of designing those changes. She set down her coffee cup. In what capacity? She asked. That's part of what we'd like to discuss. Your contract runs through the end of next month. We'd like to extend it, and we'd like to have a conversation about what a more permanent arrangement might look like. Another pause. You know this department in ways that take most people years to develop, and you know what's broken in it in ways that, frankly, we didn't see until it was almost too late. She stood in her kitchen and looked out the window at the parking lot and the gray Pennsylvania sky beyond it. I'll come in Monday, she said. We can talk then. Monday's fine. He paused one more time, and in that pause was something that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite gratitude, but was somewhere in the weighted space between them. Ms. Hayes, for what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't transfer. She ended the call. She stood with the phone in her hand and the coffee cooling beside her, and the window showing her the ordinary exterior of a life that was no longer exactly what it had been 48 hours ago. She thought about what Reeves had said. You've been moving because it was easier than standing still. She thought about the monitor in Bay 4 climbing. 81, 84, 88, 92. She thought about 4 years of careful invisibility and what it had cost and whether any of it had actually worked. And she thought about a man who was going to be at his daughter's birthday because she hadn't hesitated. She picked up her coffee. She was halfway through it when her laptop chimed from the table, an email notification, which she would normally have let sit until morning. She opened it. The sender was an address from within the Army Medical Command domain, not Vashti's office and not Arden's, a name she didn't immediately recognize, with a rank she noted automatically. The subject line read, Formal Inquiry, Hayes, Madeline A., Advisory Track Candidacy. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she set her coffee down, pulled out the chair, and sat in front of her laptop. The email was 2 paragraphs. The first was formal and procedural, an invitation to consider a civilian advisory role with Army Medical Command, the parameters of which were attached in a separate document. The second paragraph was 3 sentences. Your testimony today was reviewed in real time by the evaluation panel. I want you to be aware that the commendation discrepancy raised by the defense has been formally rebuked in our internal record. Whatever you decide about the advisory track, your record, as it stands, is complete and accurate and will not be touched. She read those 3 sentences twice. Then she opened the attachment and started reading. She was 4 pages in when her phone rang again. Unknown number. Not a military domain she recognized. Not Reeves. Not anyone in her contact list. She answered. Ms. Hayes. A man's voice, smooth and practiced, with the cadence of someone who had spent years in rooms where the way you said things mattered as much as what you said. My name is Victor Ferris. I think we should talk. She didn't answer immediately. That was the first thing. The pause, the deliberate beat of silence in which she identified the name, confirmed that this was the person Reeves had named, and made a decision about how to handle the next 3 minutes. "Mr. Ferris," she said, "I appreciate you picking up." His voice had the practiced warmth of someone who had learned that warmth was a tool. "I imagine you know who I am at this point." "I have a general sense." "Then I'll be direct." A slight shift in his tone, the warmth pulling back slightly, showing the architecture beneath it. "The situation has moved in some directions that I don't think serve anyone particularly well, including you." "Is that your assessment?" "It is. And I think a brief conversation, private, informal, could help clarify some things." He paused. "I'm not your adversary, Ms. Hayes." She walked to her kitchen window and looked out at the parking lot and the thinning evening light. "You used Garrison Wolfe," she said. "You identified a personal conflict he had with me, gave him the framing and the language to escalate it into an official complaint, and did it specifically because my professional record needed to be complicated before I testified." She kept her voice even. "That's the shape of what happened." Silence on his end. Then, "That's a significant characterization. Is it inaccurate?" Another pause, longer this time. The pause of someone recalibrating. "What I did," he said carefully, "was share information with a colleague who had expressed concerns about a staff member. What he chose to do with that information was his decision." That's a very specific way of describing coordination. "Ms. Hayes," the warmth was entirely gone now, "I'm calling because the people I've been working with are going to face significant legal exposure in the coming weeks. The investigation is going to pull in a lot of material. I think it would benefit both of us to have a clear understanding of—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. "I'm going to tell you one thing," she said, "and then I'm going to end this call." She kept her voice level and specific. "Whatever you think you can offer me, or whatever you think you can ask me to help contain, I have nothing to trade with you and nothing I want from you. If you attempt to contact me again, I'll forward the record of this call to Vashti's office. If you attempt to contact anyone else at this hospital or anyone connected to this investigation with a similar purpose, that's a decision you should discuss with your attorney before you make it." She ended the call. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Her hands were completely steady, which was either a good sign or the kind of sign that only becomes interpretable after the fact. She found Reeves in her contacts and called him. He picked up on the first ring. "Ferris just called me," she said. A beat of silence. "What did he want?" To manage the situation, he was vague about the specifics. She paused. "He's scared." "He should be." She could hear Reeves moving, a chair, the sound of a door. "Did he threaten you?" "No, he was too careful for that. But he wanted something." She thought about his voice, the specific texture of the practiced smoothness pulling back to show the frame beneath. "He wanted me to give him room. I didn't. I'm going to call Vashti's office tonight. I already told him I would. He needs to know his window is closed." She paused. "Reeves, how exposed is he?" "Significantly. The coordination with Wolfe is documented in the internal messages that Arden's team pulled. Ferris's name is in those messages explicitly." He paused. "He's trying to get ahead of it. Calling you was a mistake." "He knows that now." "Hayes," his voice shifted slightly. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." She looked out the window again. "I'll email Vashti's office tonight with a summary of the call, timestamps, what he said, how it ended." "Do that." A pause. "And then stop working for the night. You've been running for 4 days straight." She almost said something about how that wasn't his call to make, and then didn't because it also wasn't wrong. "Good night, Reeves," she said. "Night, Hayes." She wrote the summary email in 20 minutes, precise, factual, no editorializing, and sent it to Vashti's office at 9:47. Then she closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. She slept through the night for the first time in a week. The weekend moved differently than the week had. She was off shift and didn't go to the hospital and tried to let the days have some of their ordinary texture back. A long walk Saturday morning through the older part of Dunmore, where the architecture still showed the industrial century in its bones. A farmer's market she'd passed every week without stopping that she finally stopped at. A long afternoon with a book she'd been carrying from contract to contract for 3 months without opening. She called her sister Sunday afternoon. The call lasted 40 minutes and covered nothing about any of it, just the ordinary fabric of family, her nephew's new obsession with model trains, a disagreement about Thanksgiving that had apparently been ongoing for 2 years before she'd become aware of it. She laughed twice at things that were genuinely funny and felt the specific relief of being known outside of context, outside of her professional self and her military history and the weight of the week. When she ended the call, she sat for a while in the quiet apartment and let herself be tired in a way she hadn't allowed during the days when being tired was a liability. She thought about what Reeves had said. "You've been moving because it was easier than standing still." She thought about the woman who'd arrived at Kettrick 6 weeks ago on a 12-week contract, deliberate in her invisibility, precise in her limits, careful not to be anywhere long enough to have to be fully known. She'd told herself it was practical. Adaptability. The right disposition for a travel contract. She thought about Bay 4, about the decision that hadn't felt like a decision at all, just the immediate and irreducible response to what was in front of her. That was the thing about the training she'd had, and the years she'd spent applying it in places where the margin for error was zero. It didn't stay separate from who you were. You didn't leave it at the edge of the civilian world when you came back. You brought it with you whether you wanted to or not, and then the question was whether you used it or spent your energy trying to keep it out of sight. She'd been keeping it out of sight. She looked at the email from Army Medical Command that was still open in a tab on her laptop, the advisory track document. She'd read all 12 pages twice now. It was a real thing, not a courtesy, not a vague invitation, but a structured role with clear parameters. Civilian consultant status, protocol development, training program review. The kind of work that used everything she knew without requiring her to go back to the places she'd been. She read it a third time on Sunday evening. She didn't make a decision, she let it sit. That was also something she'd learned. Not every decision needed to be made at the edge of the moment. Some decisions were better made from the middle of your own stillness. Monday morning, she arrived at Kettrick at 8:15 and found the department running with the specific efficiency of a place that has been through something and come out the other side and is now recalibrating. The absence of Wolf was present in the way absences are, in the adjusted movements of the residents, in the slightly different energy at the nurse's station, in the way the attending covering his cases moved with less performance and more work. Deja was at the station. She looked up when Madeline came through the door. "You look like you slept," she said. "I did." "Good." She handed her a patient tablet without ceremony. "Bay 3 is yours. 47-year-old, chest pain, rule out MI. Troponins pending." Madeline took the tablet and went to work. That was the thing about a hospital. It didn't pause for anyone's internal reckoning. The work kept arriving, and that was, she had come to understand, not a hardship, but a kind of structure. Something to push against that pushed back with appropriate resistance. She spent the morning managing 4 cases with the particular focus that good clinical work requires, which is total and leaves very little room for anything else. At 11:30, Marcus Tillman appeared at the edge of Bay 6, where she was reviewing labs, and said quietly, "Hearing anything from the board about Holloway?" "Not directly," she said. "Osei's keeping the specific findings contained while the review runs." "But she's not coming back." She looked at him. "I don't know that officially." "Right." He nodded, processing something. "The second complaint. The one about scope of practice. I've been thinking about how it was framed, the specific language. It was almost like someone had studied the licensure statutes before writing it." "Someone had." His jaw tightened, using HR as a weapon against a witness. "It didn't work. It almost did. Almost is the operating word." She went back to the labs. "Marcus, write up the Bay 4 case for the department journal. Patient outcomes, clinical decision timeline, the full picture. Do it properly, with Nambiar as co-author if she's willing. Put it in the record." He looked at her. "You want me to document what you did?" "I want you to document what happened. There's a difference." She looked up. "It's a good case study for emergency decision-making under resource constraints. The medicine stands on its own." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through the layers of what she was saying, the professional value, the institutional record, and underneath both of those, the permanent documentation of a clinical reality that no one would be able to retroactively complicate. Nambiar will do it, he said. She told me last week she wished she'd said something sooner. Tell her sooner is now. He nodded and walked away with the particular energy of someone who has been given something useful to do, which was its own form of good. The meeting with Osei was at 2. She sat across from him in the office with the corner windows and the rain-washed view of the back campus and listened while he walked through what the board had decided. Some of it she'd expected. Some of it moved further than she'd anticipated. The HR review process was being redesigned from the ground up. External oversight for any complaints involving potential conflicts of interest, mandatory documentation of complaint origins, a 30-day cooling period before any travel staff conduct review could result in contract action. He described these changes with the careful precision of an institution that has identified a failure and is determined not to have that particular conversation again. Sandra Holloway's administrative leave had been converted over the weekend to a termination. The board had reviewed the communications Arden's office had flagged, and the determination, worded carefully, as institutional determinations are, was that her handling of the complaints had constituted a material breach of her professional obligations. She would not be returning. The legal exposure question is being handled by our attorneys, and I won't speak to it beyond that, Osei said. But the institutional position is clear. Madeline nodded. Now, he said, and his tone shifted slightly. The question of your role going forward. He folded his hands. I spoke with Joyce Partridge and with Dr. Nambiar about what restructuring the emergency department's protocols and training structure would actually require. Both of them independently mentioned your name before I raised it. She hadn't known that. We're proposing, Osei continued, a hybrid role. Clinical nursing, your hours, your cases, your terms, combined with a formal advisory function on protocol development, specifically around emergency response in mass casualty and critical decision-making scenarios. He paused. We'd bring in an outside consultant to help structure the advisory component, but the clinical expertise driving it would be yours. She looked at him. It's a staff position, she said, not contract. If you want it to be. She sat with that for a moment. The window behind him showed the back campus, a stretch of lawn, a walkway, the edge of the parking structure. Ordinary institutional landscape that she'd been looking at for 6 weeks without it meaning anything in particular. I'd want Joyce involved in the protocol redesign, she said. Her institutional knowledge of what's broken is more comprehensive than mine. That's already my assumption. And I'd want the advisory component structured with input from the residents. Tillman specifically. She paused, chose words. He has good instincts, and he's close enough to his training to see where the gaps actually are. Osei made a note. Anything else? The mass casualty response protocol. What's currently written is inadequate for the kind of event we had Tuesday. I'd want that to be the first priority. Agreed. She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression of someone who has been in administration long enough to recognize when they're in the presence of someone who actually knows what they're doing and is correctly directing that toward a useful end. I'll give you an answer by Wednesday, she said. That's fine. He paused. Ms. Hayes, I want to say something, and I want you to take it as a direct statement and not as institutional language. He met her eyes. What happened to you here? The complaints, the process, the way this department responded to your presence over the past 6 weeks was wrong. Not procedurally wrong. Actually, wrong. The kind of wrong that happens when a place decides someone is less than they are, and then builds a system to confirm that decision. He paused. I'm sorry it happened here. The apology landed differently than his first one had. Less administrative, more specific. It had the weight of something he'd been working his way towards saying. Thank you, she said. That matters. She left his office and took the stairs instead of the elevator, which she did when she needed the 3 floors to be something her body moved through rather than was delivered across. She came out on the main floor and walked back toward the bay and thought about Wednesday and what her answer would be and how much of it she already knew. On Tuesday morning, the Dunmore Courier-Tribune ran a story. She found it through a text from Deja at 6:53 a.m., with a link and no additional commentary. which was how Deja communicated things she thought Madeline should see but didn't want to be responsible for the reaction to. The story was on the regional news page, not the front. The headline was specific: Kettrick Memorial Officers Out Following Army Inquiry into Staff Conduct Review. The byline belonged to a reporter she didn't know. The story covered Wolf's resignation and Holloway's termination in the careful language of something that's been partially confirmed and partially reconstructed from public record and background sources. It named the Army Medical Command inquiry. It noted that the conduct review at issue had involved a travel nurse who was a material witness in a federal investigation. It did not name her. The last 3 paragraphs of the story covered the military investigation itself. Not in detail, because the details were not yet public record, but in enough outline that anyone paying attention would understand that something significant had been happening and that Kettrick had been, in some peripheral way, where part of it surfaced. She put her phone down and finished her coffee. By the time she arrived on the floor, the story had traveled through the department in the way things travel through hospitals. She could see it in the particular quality of the attention around her. Not hostile, not exactly supportive, but recalibrated. People looking at her with the specific reassessment of those who have received new information about someone they thought they'd already categorized. She did her job. She checked her patients, updated her charts, consulted with Nambiar on a difficult respiratory case in Bay 8 that required the specific combination of clinical instinct and careful procedure that Madeline had come to think of as the part of nursing that nobody wrote down. Nambiar worked with her without the half measure of the previous weeks, something having opened between them that the events had made possible without either of them needing to name it. At 10:15, she got a call from Vashti's office. She stepped out and took it in the family consultation room, the one with the tissue box, and listened while the attorney on the other end walked her through what was happening in formal terms. Victor Ferris had retained legal counsel over the weekend. He was cooperating with the investigation. That cooperation had been, apparently, more comprehensive than anyone had predicted. The attorney's phrase was substantially accelerating the timeline, which Madeline translated as, he'd decided that the calculation had shifted, and the best version of his situation involved telling the truth before it was extracted. The 3 officers formally charged in the procurement fraud case had received notice of additional charges relating to witness intimidation and obstruction. The defense strategy of discrediting Madeline's record had been formally withdrawn from their legal filings. "What does that mean for my testimony?" she asked. "It means the record stands as given. The commendation, the incident report, your account of events, all of it is confirmed by the additional material Ferris provided." The attorney paused. "You should expect a formal letter from this office by the end of the week. It will constitute official clearance of any suggestion of misconduct in connection with the original report." She stood by the window in the small room and looked at the familiar view of the parking structure. "Thank you," she said. She ended the call. The tissue box was on its shelf. She'd thought before that it was presumptuous. She no longer found it particularly offensive. She stood in the room for 3 minutes before she went back to the floor. Wednesday morning, she emailed Osi. "I'll take the position. Let's talk structure next week." She sent it at 7:04 and went to work. At 11, Reeves called. "The formal charges were announced this morning," he said. 3 officers, 2 civilian contractors. Ferris is listed as a cooperating witness. It'll be in the national news by afternoon. I saw the preliminary notice. Your name isn't in any of it. The witness protection provisions hold. I know. A pause. How are you doing with all of it? She was standing at the supply station, which had become a place, she thought, which was probably not its intended function. I'm okay, she said. And then, because she'd learned something about the cost of inexact self-reporting, I keep waiting for it to feel more dramatic, the resolution. Everything that happened, and now it's documents and emails and a news story on page 6. That's how most things end, Reeves said. Not the way they look in the moment. The moment is always louder than the aftermath. I know that. You know it, but you're still adjusting to it being true for something that was yours. She didn't answer that because he wasn't wrong, and there was nothing to add to it. Advisory track, she said after a moment. The email they sent Friday. I've read the attachment 4 times. And? And I'm staying at Kettrick, for now. There's work here that matters. She paused. but I want to talk to Vashti's office about the advisory track on a limited basis. Protocol consultation, not a full return to anything, just using what I know in a way that doesn't require me to move again. That's the hybrid version. Apparently I'm amenable to hybrid versions. He was quiet for a moment, and she could hear in his silence the specific relief of someone who has been concerned about another person for a long time and is receiving confirmation that the concern can ease. "I'll reach out to Vashti's office," he said. "I can do it myself." "I know you can." A pause. "Let me do this one thing." She let him. The formal letter from Vashti's office arrived Thursday afternoon, delivered through official channels to her email and simultaneously to Kettrick's administrative office, which Vashti had clearly decided was an appropriate audience. It was 4 paragraphs. The first established the context of the investigation. The second confirmed her cooperation and the accuracy of her testimony. The third explicitly addressed the defense filing's characterization of her record and stated in the unambiguous language of a formal military legal document that those characterizations had been withdrawn, were unsupported by evidence, and were not and would not be part of any official record related to her service. The fourth paragraph was 3 sentences. Sergeant First Class Madeline A. Hayes served with distinction across 2 combat deployments and demonstrated exceptional clinical judgment and personal integrity under conditions that few practitioners encounter. Her commendation stands without qualification. This office thanks her for her cooperation and for her willingness to correct a record that required correction. She read it at her desk in the nursing station, on her lunch break, with a half-eaten sandwich next to her keyboard. She read it twice. Then she saved it to her personal drive and went back to work. Tick. 2 weeks passed. The news story ran nationally for a day, was picked up by 3 major outlets, and then subsided the way these things do, present briefly as significant and then overtaken by the next significant thing. The Dunmore Courier-Tribune ran a follow-up piece that was more specific about Kettrick, and this one mentioned in a single sentence that the travel nurse at the center of the hospital's conduct review had been formally cleared and had accepted a permanent staff position. Still no name, she didn't mind that. Holloway's situation resolved through the hospital's legal process, a termination agreement with a non-disclosure provision that Osei described to her in general terms and didn't elaborate on, which she understood as the institution had decided on the quietest version of accountability that was still accountability and had accepted that as the available outcome. She did not think it was enough. She also understood that what she thought it should be and what institutions were capable of delivering were different measurements, and that demanding the former while rejecting the latter left you standing on principle in an empty room. She accepted the outcome and kept the opinion. Wolf's situation was more exposed. His resignation had been voluntary, but the documentation surrounding it was not sealed, and the medical board had opened a review of the complaint filings, both the original conduct complaint and the second one that Arden's team had flagged. She heard through Joyce, who heard it through the operational channels that nursing supervisors inhabit, that the review was expected to result in a formal censure and a mandatory ethics training requirement. Whether his hospital privileges elsewhere would be affected depended on whether the censure's language was strong enough to trigger reporting obligations. She thought about him sometimes, not with satisfaction exactly, and not with sympathy. Somewhere in the space between those two things, where you put the people who wronged you and who then had to face something real for it, and who are still, underneath all of it, just people. He had been afraid of her competence and had mistaken that fear for professional concern. The mistake had cost him more than he'd intended to pay. Whether he understood yet what the error actually was, not the tactical one, but the fundamental one, she had no way of knowing. Some people got to the understanding. Some people didn't. That was also true of herself, and she tried to hold that with some honesty. The protocol redesign took 6 weeks to draft and another 2 to present to the department. She worked on it with Joyce and with Marcus and with 2 residents who'd been there for the mass casualty event and who brought the specific knowledge of people who had been in the gap between protocol and reality and had felt the distance. The final document was 41 pages. It covered mass casualty triage sequencing, attending authorization pathways for emergency interventions, clear escalation protocols for when standard authorization was unavailable, and a set of documentation standards that created a contemporaneous record of clinical decisions in real time. The last section was Joyce's contribution, a reporting structure for workplace conduct that included an independent review mechanism with no department hierarchy involvement for cases involving potential conflicts of interest. Joyce had titled that section, with the particular dry precision of someone who had spent 6 years watching the system fail in specific ways. Conflict of interest provisions? What should have existed before? Osei accepted the document without modification. He presented it to the board on a Tuesday morning in November, 4 months after a helicopter went down on Route 9 and 19 soldiers came through a trauma bay, and one nurse who wasn't supposed to be in the middle of it stepped into the middle of it anyway. Madeline wasn't at the board presentation. She was on the floor, working a day shift in the emergency department that was busy in the ordinary ways. A broken wrist from a school playground, a 63-year-old with blood pressure readings that needed immediate management, a young man with a laceration above his eyebrow from something he described as a disagreement with a cabinet door, and that she assessed as probably also some form of disagreement with another person. She addressed it without comment and gave him the follow-up instructions and let him keep his version of events. Deja brought her the board's formal adoption notice on a printed memo at 3 p.m, sliding it onto the desk beside her keyboard with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything. They adopted it unanimously, Deja said, effective January 1st. Madeline looked at the memo, at the formal language of institutional adoption, at the protocol title in bold at the top of the page, at the date. Good, she said. That's all you've got? It's what needed to happen. Deja looked at her for a moment. You know what the first thing Joyce said was when Osei told her the board voted? What? She said, and I'm quoting, "It's about time someone built the room instead of just surviving the one we had." Deja paused. I think she was talking about you. Madeline looked at the memo again. Then, at the bay, at the ordinary productive motion of the department around her, the residents moving with improved confidence, the nurses working the new documentation flow they'd been piloting for 2 weeks, a paramedic at the entrance transferring a patient to the intake desk with the smooth handoff of 2 systems that had learned to speak each other's language. She thought about the woman who'd arrived here 6 weeks into a 12-week contract, carrying 4 years of careful invisibility like a second skin, who had stood in a parking lot in the rain and read a text message and felt the specific cold of a person running out of road. She thought about the road she was standing on now. It was not a perfect road. The institution had failed her in specific ways and had been forced, by external pressure and its own belated accounting, to correct itself. That was not the same as choosing right, and she held the distinction. She was not naive about the machinery of places. She was not naive about herself either. She had made her own errors, the 4 years of running, the original testimony she hadn't fought hard enough to protect, the way she'd let Wolf dismiss her because confronting it would have required being seen. You paid for your errors and other people's errors, and sometimes the difference between them wasn't as clean as you wanted it to be. That was life working as designed. But here she was. Here the protocol was. Here was Specialist Dominguez, who was at his daughter's birthday party this weekend. She knew because he'd sent her a photograph. A little girl in a yellow dress with frosting on her nose, and a man next to her who was alive and present, and in the specific irreplaceable way that alive and present is better than the alternative. She'd put the photograph in the corner of her phone's lock screen where she'd see it every time she picked it up. Not as a monument, just as a fact she wanted to keep close. In the first week of December, she flew to Fort Meade for a 2-day consultation with Army Medical Command's protocol development team. Not the advisory track formally, that paperwork was still in progress, but an informal working session that Vashti's office had arranged and that Reeves had helped structure. She sat in a conference room with 8 people who worked at the intersection of military medicine and institutional policy, and spent 2 days being genuinely useful in the specific way you can only be useful when you've been in the places and done the work and have something to show for it that goes beyond theory. On the second evening, Vashti herself walked into the conference room at the end of the working session when most of the other participants had gone. She sat across from Madeline with a cup of coffee and said, without preamble, 4 years. Yes. I want you to know that the people responsible for what happened to your original testimony are going to face consequences that are commensurate with what they did. She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at Madeline directly. Not the consequences I would choose if it were solely up to me. Institutions protect their own in ways that are sometimes beyond what any single office can override, but commensurate. Madeline looked at her. I believe you, she said. I also want to say, and this is my own opinion, not this office's, that what you did by coming forward and the way you held the record intact in your own account, even when there was institutional pressure not to, made this investigation possible. She paused. The three other witnesses who came forward, at least two of them came forward because they heard you had. That's not something I can put in a formal letter, but it's true. Madeline looked out the conference room window at the Fort Meade campus in the December dark, at the lights moving along the distant road, at the sky that had no particular weather in it for once, just clear and cold and indifferent and full of stars that had been there before any of this and would be there after. She thought about something Reeves had said a long time ago, before any of this, in a forward operating base in a country that was loud in all the wrong places. When she'd asked him how you kept going when the institution you served kept failing the people it was supposed to protect. He'd thought about it for a longer time than she expected from him, and then he'd said, "You do the work in front of you, and you stay honest about what the work is. And eventually the distance between what a thing should be and what it is either closes or it doesn't, and your job is to keep working regardless." She hadn't entirely understood it then. She understood it better now, with the specific comprehension that comes from living something rather than hearing it. "Thank you," she said to Vashti, "for pursuing it. Thank you for making it pursuable." They finished their coffee in the quiet of the conference room, and the base hummed its ordinary institutional life around them, and outside the stars were indifferent and present and exactly where they'd always been. She drove back to Dunmore on a Thursday in a car she'd borrowed from the rental lot at the airport, and she pulled into the Kettrick Memorial parking structure at 7:20 in the morning, 20 minutes before her shift, and sat for a moment in the car before going in. She thought about the version of herself that had pulled into this same structure 6 weeks into a 12-week contract with the express intention of being nobody, efficient, invisible, temporary. She'd been good at it. She'd been very good at it. She thought about what it had cost and what it had been worth and landed, as she'd been landing for the past several weeks, on the honest answer, which was some of each, and the accounting wasn't done yet, and that was fine. She thought about the things she'd been given by the people in this building. Not given easily, not given without their own complications, but given Deja's specific loyalty, Marcus's uncomplicated indignation, Joyce's institutional endurance, Ose's late but real accountability, the particular look on Dominguez's face when she told him to drink his fluids and let himself heal. She thought about the work, the protocol, the 41 pages that were going to change how people were treated in crisis situations inside these walls, and which would be applied next month to the first mass casualty event or the next impossible triage decision, and would create some small margin of difference for someone who would never know the document existed. The best work was always invisible to the person it helped. That was one of the things about it. She got out of the car. She walked through the side entrance and through the corridor and into the emergency department, which was already running, the morning shift finding its rhythm, monitors doing their steady accounting of the lives they were watching. Deja was at the station. She looked up. "You're back?" "I'm back." "How was it?" "Useful." She set her bag down. "What's in the bay?" Deja handed her a tablet without ceremony. "Bay 4, which I know is..." She paused. "I know you have some history with Bay 4. Madeline looked at the tablet, looked at the bay. "Everybody has history somewhere," she said. She went to work. The monitor beeped its steady count. The department moved around her with the organized urgency of a place that was, imperfectly and with effort and with the accumulated knowledge of everyone in it, doing the thing it was built to do. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it had been easy, not because it had been without cost, or without people who had decided she was less than she was and had tried to make that decision stick. Not because the institutions that had failed her had fully corrected themselves, or ever would, but because she had not hidden when it counted, because she had held the record straight when someone else tried to bend it. Because she had walked into a room with a letter in her pocket and stood her ground on the one fact that no one could take from her, that she knew what she knew, had done what she'd done, and was not interested in anyone else's version of it. Some people spend a lifetime making themselves small because the world has a habit of punishing people who take up space. Some people make themselves invisible not out of weakness, but out of the accumulated weight of a world that has told them, in specific and repeated ways, that their visibility is a problem to be solved. Madeline Hayes had done that, had done it for 4 years with considerable skill, and then a helicopter had gone down and 19 soldiers had come through a bay door, and something in her that was older and more stubborn than the invisibility had simply refused to wait any longer. That was the thing about who you actually were. It didn't disappear because you put it somewhere quiet. It waited. And when the moment came that was larger than the hiding, it stepped forward. You couldn't build a life on being less than you were. Eventually, the gap between the life and the person became too wide. And something had to give. She had finally let it be the hiding. The monitor counted. The department moved. Bay 4 again. The same room, different morning, entirely different ground. She looked at her patient, 44 years old, presenting with chest tightness and shortness of breath, and the particular fear of someone whose body has just reminded them how little control any of us have over the next 10 minutes. "Hi," she said. "I'm Madeline. Tell me what's happening." He told her. She listened with her whole attention, the way she'd been taught, and the way she'd always done, even when the world around her was telling her that her attention didn't matter, that her presence was a problem, that the work she did and knew how to do was less valuable than someone else's credential or title, or decades of performed authority. She listened. She assessed. She acted. That had always been enough. It was still enough. It always would be.